Good morning, America. How are ya? Monday Morning Rail. I'm your native son. I'm the train they call the City of New Orleans. Hi, I'm Denny Jelsma, and I'm at the world famous Jacksonville Terminal Railroad Museum. It's Monday morning, and you know what we do on Monday? You guessed it. We do show and tell starts right now. Show and Tell starts right now on Monday morning in beautiful Jacksonville, Florida, where the sun always shines and it's a pleasure running trains. This morning's Show and Tell is another train that I really love. It is called the North Star. It is of the Minneapolis St. Louis, the M&StL, the old Louis, they called it, and it ran from Minneapolis, St. Paul through southern Minnesota, all through Iowa, got onto the Wabash at Albia, Iowa, and went on to St. Louis. So if you were a businessman and you needed to go to St. Louis, you had a choice. Basically, you could choose between the Rock Island or you could choose the M&StL. Today I'm going to show you the North Star, and that was their #1 hot train for the Minneapolis-St. Louis. The year is 1935, or in the 30s. And this is the engine that they used to pull it, Pacific. This particular engine here is a Broadway Pacific. I had Mike Stamey of Southeast Models put in on the side, lettered it, and made it pretty well matched the 502 that the M&StL. This was a very famous engine for the M&StL. And so this particular railroad is really dear to my heart because my grandfather started in 1907 on the Iowa Central as a fireman out of Oskaloosa, Iowa, and he went up, his run was up to Marshalltown and then back. And you got to understand that they had division points all up and down the engines in the 20s and 30s. 50 to 100 miles was a division point. And so the M&StL bought the Iowa Central, and so my legacy of railroad history is on my grandfather on my mother's side. But if you were a businessman and you decided that, hey, you have a meeting in St. Louis, Missouri, and you tell your secretary, book me a trip to St. Louis. Back then, all executives had secretaries. They kind of done away with that now. But she would call either a travel agent or she would get a hold of a representative of two different railroads that she was familiar with, and she would either call the M&StL or the Rock Island. It was a total of about 600 miles. Well, today you could drive that in maybe 12 hours. Back then, there just wasn't that many paved roads yet. They really didn't start paving roads here in America and throughout the country till the Depression. The WPA was a big project where they would pave roads in certain smaller states. And so the secretary would look up, and boy, she got the morning paper, and you could see she saw an ad in the Minneapolis Star, and it says an exciting dining car experience when you ride the M&StL and the Wabash to St. Louis. So she says, hey, I'm going to book my boss on this train. And so she gets all the arrangements and gives him the ticket. She puts him in a Pullman, and she knows him. He wanted a big bedroom, so he got a big bedroom. And the train left Minneapolis at 4:15. So the executive does his day work, calls his wife, and she takes him to the train station in Minneapolis. He gets on, and the train leaves at 4:15. And here is some of the train that you could see here. It was a joint venture between the Wabash and the M&StL. And so it always naturally had an RPO, it had baggage, sometimes a combine that was supplied by the Wabash. It had a coach depending upon the traffic. Sometimes they'd have 2 to 3 coaches, and they always had a diner. And so then they had 2 to 3 sleeping cars. They always had a lounge car, and basically this was for the men to smoke their cigars. And then they had the observation car. The observation car was switched between the Wabash and the M&StL. M&StL supplied 101, which actually ended up being their business car. But the train left the Twin Cities. It got to Marshalltown, Iowa at 11 o'clock at night. So you got on the train at 4 o'clock. Probably around 6 o'clock or so, you were near Albert Lee, Minnesota, and you went into the dining car and you got yourself a nice meal. And after the meal, you went to the lounge car, smoked your cigar, had some conversation with other businessmen going to St. Louis, and the train got into Oskaloosa, Iowa, which was another division point, and it got there at about 1 o'clock. Now, this train averaged about 30 miles an hour. It was not a fast train. And most of the trains back in the 30s, except the real hot limited like the 20th century or the Broadway, they were speedsters, but most of the other trains throughout the United States averaged 30 miles an hour. This train probably got up to maybe 40, 45 miles an hour on some straight through southern Minnesota and northern Iowa. And that's all the faster it would go. It was still faster than going in an automobile because you either had mud roads or no roads. And so the train got to Albia, Iowa, which is just south of Oskaloosa, about 20 miles, and they handed this train, the M&StL handed it over to the Wabash. The Wabash had a line from Des Moines, Iowa to Moberly, Missouri to St. Louis, Missouri. And their trading partner was the Wabash. So this train was handed over at Albia in the middle of the night, and they switched engines, and the Wabash took it from Albia, Iowa, on down to Moberly, Missouri. Now, Albia, people in the Midwest watching, they say, hey, that was a CB&Q town. You bet it was. But back in the 30s, the M&StL and the Wabash had a great presence in Albia, Iowa, where they went north and south, the CB&Q went east and west. And naturally, and we know that the CB&Q was prominent in Albia very much so. But Albia was a very active town, and in the middle of the night, they handled the North Star. And so when it got into Moberly at around 6 o'clock in the morning, there was another crew change. It was combined with the train from Omaha, and it they took the 2 trains from Omaha, and then actually it was almost 3 trains combined, because they took the Des Moines train, they took the Minneapolis train, and they combined a lot of trains in Moberly, and then they went east to St. Louis. And they arrived at about 10 o'clock in the morning. So the executive got off, had his business lunch, spent a couple of days, and then on his return trip, he left St. Louis at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and he did the same trip going back. And this trip took about 18 hours to make. And so left St. Louis at 2 o'clock, and he got back into Minneapolis at 7:30 in the morning. It was basically a night train. And that is the North Star of the Minneapolis-St. Louis. The opposite competitor that they could have taken would have been the Rock Island. And I'm going to do a segment coming up soon, and it's on the Zephyr Rocket. Zephyr Rocket actually didn't get started till about 1941, but it knocked about 2 hours off the train, and then later on, as they improved service, they did it in about 14 hours so instead of the 18. And that's the way it is at the world famous Jacksonville Terminal Railroad Museum in beautiful Jacksonville, Florida.